I want to continue. So between 1933 and the next period, which is the civil rights, which starts in 1954, we have something big that happens. And we said that big thing was World War II, right? World War II started, and the United States again didn't join until the end. But at the end of the war, the United States joined. Do you have a question? The United States joined after Japan bombed the United States. Okay? Japan bombed the United States in Pearl Harbor. And the United States got very angry and it joined the war. And it came to Europe and it helped the Allies win the war. And what happened at the end of the war? What did the United States do in Japan? Yes? Yeah, they sent 2 nuclear bombs. So the war was almost over at this point. The war was already won, basically. It was just, when will Japan surrender, say, I give up? Well, the United States was developing a lot of new technology, of new bombs, new things for war. And they started looking ahead to the future. Last time we had a war, we came out really well. This time, we want to come out even better. So they threw the nuclear bombs on Japan, and that showed the rest of the world that the US had the biggest bombs in the world, the most dangerous. So many people died. So that was sending a message to the rest of the world: don't mess with us. Don't get angry with us because we are the superpower. So the World War II ended. All the soldiers that were in Europe came back to the United States. And who were the soldiers who were fighting in the war? Who do you think was fighting in the wars? Was it the rich people who were fighting in the wars? It was usually the poor people. And who were the poor people in the United States? Black people mostly. Because yes, there was no more slavery. There was no more slavery, but a lot of the economic conditions were not very good for black people. So all of these black people had been in Europe, and they had been fighting for the war for the United States, and they had been in Europe. And in Europe, they had been treated all right. They had been treated quite well. They come to the United States, and they had finished the war. They thought they would be treated like heroes. Did that happen? No. They weren't treated very well. So this is when we come to the civil rights. In the civil rights movement, the soldiers who were black came back from the war, and they weren't treated well. There was Jim Crow segregation. What is Jim Crow segregation? Jim Crow segregation were laws that said white people and black people cannot be in the same place. So the best places were reserved for only white people. Black people had separate kitchens where they could eat, restaurants where they could go. They had to sit in the back of the bus. They couldn't sit anywhere they wanted. They only had a few seats available to them. So there was segregation, which means separation of people. They were separating the white people and the black people. White people and black people could not be in the same school. They could not go to the same hospitals. They could not have the same jobs. And people were angry about this. One such person who was very angry about this was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a black reverend who was very famous, and he became a leader of the civil rights movement. He protested, he marched, he organized boycotts, sit-ins, different forms of protest to get the same rights for black people as for white people. But what else was going on during this time? So the United States had ended the war and it had been victorious. It had a lot of power. But who else had a lot of power during that time? After the end of the World War I? Russia, the Soviet Union. So those were the 2 superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, right? They were fighting a Cold War, which means they weren't directly fighting, but they were fighting in other places, right? So they weren't fighting US versus Russia, but the US was fighting against Vietnam because Vietnam was communist and it was an ally of Russia. Russia was going into Cuba because Cuba is very close to the United States. So it was like a war that was indirect. And that is what is happening. There is a big war going on in Vietnam, and a lot of people are dying. And at this time, television is becoming a thing. So television, people are seeing in television, wow, so many people are dying. We hadn't realized. So there was a big peace movement, anti-war movement that was happening all over the world and also in the United States. It started in Paris in 1968 in France, but then it moved to the United States and it became an anti-war effort, a peace effort. And that joined in with the civil rights. Like, yes, we should all have rights. No, we should not be fighting wars. We should all love each other. And that is the birth of the hippie movement as well in the United States. So that is what is happening during the civil rights movement. What happened at the end? Dr. Martin Luther King and the pressure of the black community and the black activists forced the US government to sign the Civil Rights Act, which meant that black people and white people had the same rights. Finally, they had the same rights, okay? And what happened a few years later? Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was killed. Because people weren't happy, some white people weren't happy that black people had the same rights. So that is what happened at the end of the civil rights movement. And that is 1960s, 1970s. And then we get